Well, thank you all. Again, welcome back as we are winding up our two-day session. So we are down to our last speaker, and it is our pleasure to have Dr. Mark Feinberg join us. Dr. Feinberg's task is to, given his experience and at least to some degree what conversation has revolved around for the last couple of days and his vast previous understanding and experience, he's been tasked with outlining a vision for the future of scientific research, given incorporating what we've learned from COVID-19. No pressure. I'm echoing a little bit. We're good? Okay. I would note that after Dr. Feinberg's presentation, we are going to ask for feedback from you all. We're going to ask for feedback from the audience to get a sense from what you all have seen and learned over the last couple of days to try and get a sense of, in particular, the most important points that we all as a group think should be takeaways from our experiences and our conversations over the last couple of days. Let me introduce, though, Dr. Feinberg. Dr. Feinberg has more than 20 years of experience in studying the biology of emergent disease in both academia and government research. He is the president and CEO of the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative, where he leads a global team that works to advance development of vaccines and other biomedical innovations to combat pathogens, including HIV, TB, and other diseases that disproportionately impact low-income populations. In the past, prior to this responsibility, he was Chief Public Health and Science Officer at Merck Vaccines, where, again, he led multiple initiatives to address unmet health needs and develop laboratory capacity in low-income communities. So it's our pleasure, and for me to welcome Dr. Feinberg.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be with you over the past couple of days. I think the discussions have been really informative and serious and insightful, and I really appreciate being part of it and being asked to speak with you today. I do want to alert you to false advertising. The program lists visionary presentation being made by me, and I think maybe delusional would be a little bit more realistic, but you'll just have to judge for yourself. I was asked to sort of reflect on some of the discussions that I've heard, but also, talk about maybe some things that haven't been addressed. And my foundation for doing this is in the context of having been involved in the development of a number of vaccines against both, endemic and epidemic diseases. And I guess what I want to emphasize is things that maybe haven't been said and maybe issues that I believe need to be addressed, and perhaps they're insurmountable, but I think it's important to put it out there just so we can think about this and see how far down the road we can get to solutions that really make a difference in the way that we want. This meeting is happening really at an extraordinary time. The lessons of the COVID-19 pandemic are very significant and powerful, and we need to pay attention to them, and we need to stay focused on them, as have been highlighted. But clearly, we've seen amazing, global health and vaccine innovation over this period. We have been reminded, as has been discussed extensively, that the issue about prompt, equitable, and affordable access is something that we don't have a solution for, and that is really tragic and needs to be restated at every moment. We've also seen how nationalism and misinformation are continuing threats and need to be addressed. We've seen, though, in addition to scientific innovation that the pandemic has brought forward, there have been a number of important partnership innovations. And I really do want to dwell on this partnership innovation theme because really to the extent to which organizations and sectors can work together in a collaborative, aligned strategy, I think is the only solution that's really going to prepare us for future pandemics or epidemics. And I think we learn by our experience, hopefully, and we've learned and experienced a lot of things here. And as the focus of this meeting is to really build on those learnings to really do better in the future. But I mean, this really does require, as you all know, that we proactively prepare. This response mode kind of strategy is clearly unsatisfactory, and I think needs a better way of doing things. This is a kind of a quaint statement. I think all of us know this, but in Peter Piot's book, which is an interesting book, as you know, Peter was one of the co-discoverers of the Ebola virus, as well as someone who made huge contributions to the fight against HIV, including a focus on global equity solutions. And this is the experience for many people, probably almost everyone in the room and listening in. There was a time in our careers when the advent of new infectious diseases was not something that we thought was going to happen frequently, if at all. And now we think that they are happening. We see that they are happening frequently and are concerned that they're going to keep happening more and more frequently. And we need a different way of thinking about that. And they're occurring faster and they're occurring in more global ways. And I just want you to reflect on one thought, which to me is a little disconcerting. I mean, COVID-19 was a really bad pandemic, but I think all of us can imagine even worse potential pandemics that spread faster, that have a higher mortality rate. And what would we do in that context? I don't think we have an answer for that, but I think that's the thing we really need to be prepared to address. You're all familiar with the different emerging infectious diseases that have popped up over time in our lifetime not so long ago. My belief is that we've learned certain things from these experiences, and we've also had some deleterious outcomes from experiencing these experiences. And really the focus of this workshop is really how do we learn from COVID-19? And hopefully, my hope is we'll reflect on some of the things we've learned and missed the opportunities to learn from these other things. I mean, obviously, we learned, I'd say largely not positive things from the H1N1 experience, where there was a tension between the public sector and the private sector that was very significant. We also had the issue about ownership of viruses and strains, and nationalism became a significant issue. Obviously, SARS and MERS arose, but I don't think we took them seriously enough in thinking about preparedness. Ebola, which I'm going to talk about a lot, actually seems to have been deleted from this slide, I think was actually very influential in changing the way of thinking about things. But it's definitely going to be COVID-19 that is our biggest opportunity for learning. And if we fail to take on the challenges that have been really discussed in very articulate and thoughtful ways at this meeting, I think that will be really disappointing. We talk about public perceptions. I mean, the media or the public gets a lot of its insights from popular media. And these are two movies that I'm sure most of you have seen. This is actually a terrible movie, and the sort of solution that they come up with is confused whether it's a vaccine or an antibody. I don't know what it is, but then all of a sudden the world is saved because it's widely available almost immediately, which we know is crazy talk. Contagion was actually interesting because it was a much more scientifically rigorous movie, but it had some major gaps in it. Like, for instance, the Kate Winslet character, the CDC scientist who develops a vaccine, injects herself with it, and then miraculously the world is saved and the vaccine is widely available. But one thing that I thought was kind of hard to believe in that movie, which actually turned out to be probably the most accurate thing in the movie, I think you'll remember the Jude Law character, who was the anti-vax person who was promoting that forsythia was a cure for COVID-19. I thought that was like too way out there, but I mean, COVID-19 was showing us that that was actually an understatement. It could be worse than that. And so this is how public perceptions are shaped. And I do completely agree with what's been said about educating the public more about what this process is and their role in sort of making it successful. I want to make a distinction, which I don't think has really been made clearly at this meeting. When we talk about epidemics and emerging epidemic threats, and then we talk about pandemics, there are distinctions to be made. Clearly, COVID is a real pandemic that's impacting everyone all around the world. But you talk about diseases like Ebola or Lassa fever; those tend to be geographically localized. They tend to be smaller, and I think it's worth probably thinking about what is the distinction between what needs to be done for each kind of pathogen. And clearly, when you think about the traditional source of vaccine innovation, which has been private sector companies, this is a very unattractive space to be in for all the reasons that you know. Obviously, there's small markets, there are limited resourcing, there's no return on investment. Nationalism is a big issue. We've seen that certainly with COVID. A lot of these have, scientific complexity, which require, concerted R&D efforts to overcome. There's an investment risk, for private sector entities, which are, for-profit companies, and this isn't an attractive space for them to work in. And we've often been left with reactive vaccine research, and that's, as we all know, and has been stated a million times in this meeting, that's not going to get the job done. When you think about product development, though, I learned a lot when I was working in the private sector at Merck. When I was an academic, I thought I knew about vaccine development, and then I go work at Merck. I realized I don't know anything about real vaccine development, and most of what I thought about it I thought I knew was wrong. But I mean, when you're actually thinking about what's necessary, you realize that the current models actually are not set up to get the job done, because vaccine development truly is dependent upon an end-to-end view from discovery all the way to implementation. And it's not just a unidirectional flow of information, it's a bidirectional flow of information where you need to understand what your goal is and who your target population is and what their preferences are if you're going to be successful at translating the science into an impact. It's actually really hard to do that end-to-end product development, even when you're working for a single company that is, everyone has the same incentive, presumably. When you think about doing that, when you're involving multiple stakeholders, multiple sectors, multiple funders, multiple populations, it's really hard to maintain that line of sight to, that end-to-end view. And that basically means there's lots of problems with different people engaged in the activities not having the same perspectives, not having the same goals, and you're trying to drive the train down the track to get to the goal, and it's there are gaps in the railroad, and that is really potentially problematic. And when we're talking about the kind of threats we're talking about, I strongly believe that no one sector can do it by itself. It's not a private sector obligation to solve this. It's not a public sector obligation to solve it. I think it's everyone's obligation to solve it, which means we need to understand the dynamics of product development so that we can actually deliver on what's necessary to accomplish results, and we need to do it as quickly and effectively as possible. And the point that our friend Mike Osterholm made, which I agree with, is that the only ultimate solution will engage in some way the private sector in this enterprise. And how do you do that in a way that is motivating and sustainable for them? But it's not just the partners involved, the sort of funding mechanisms we use, whether it's, government grants or donor funding, government, support for initiatives like CEPI, those things are, often done on a program-specific way around a specific product that is right before you. The idea of making investments well in advance and at risk is not commonly taken into account here. It's very hard to make that case. When you have different sectors having different priorities, you can end up with tensions, if not overt hostilities, which has been seen with a number of instances that you're all very familiar with. And we need to understand how to align everyone if we're going to have a common goal and work as efficiently and effectively as possible. The private sector is a pretty, in many ways, powerful addition to this equation, but I think their connection to it is pretty tenuous. And I think they are very worried about opportunity costs and distraction factors of getting involved in this kind of work. People see, the amazing profits that have been made by companies like Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna, and they think that this is a very attractive commercial opportunity. Those are definitely outliers in this space, and if the goal becomes profit generation, then that's not going to be a good solution either. So figuring out how to engage the private sector in a way that secures their commitment and access to their expertise and insights, but doesn't overburden them, but also doesn't get into this situation where the only motivation for them to engage is a perception of whether or not they will generate a profit from it. So my first direct connection to some of the issues that I'm raising relates to the Ebola vaccine development program, which is a program that I led when I was previously at Merck. And this history, I think, is illustrative in a couple of ways, and what happened subsequently, I think, is also illustrative. So, please forgive me for giving a personal anecdote, which I was asked to do. So this was the epidemic curve in the 2014 to 2016 Ebola outbreak, which was the worst Ebola outbreak that's ever happened, in this case, Ebola Zaire. When this slide was, from the WHO situation report, this was like projecting it was the actual epidemiologic data, but the CDC at that time was projecting that there would be 1 million cases of Ebola, and that was pretty serious. So people were very concerned at that time. Fortunately, that didn't come to fruition. It was really bad, but it wasn't anywhere near as bad as was projected. So around the beginning of October, when this curve started going up, I got literally probably 20 phone calls from different individuals working at the WHO or organizations like BARDA or the NIH, asking Merck to get involved to help out in developing a vaccine, the VSV Ebola Zaire vaccine, which Merck ultimately did take responsibility for bringing to licensure. So I was asked to do that because there had been a small biotech that had licensed this vaccine from the Public Health Agency of Canada, where it was originally developed, but they didn't have the horsepower to actually deliver on what was like a very fast-moving, very complicated thing. And they needed a capable vaccine developer with a strong track record, especially around live viral vaccines, to get involved. So that's not a very long list of companies, and some were already interested in getting involved. And this was viewed as the most promising candidate in many ways, but there wasn't anyone who was seen as capable of advancing it. So I got a lot of people, friends, asking for Merck to help, and we persuaded the Merck senior management to get involved, which was really, I think, a very positive thing, and I'm really glad that they did that. And the reasons why they did that, I think, are really kind of interesting and in some ways quaint to look back on. They recognized that this was a major public health threat, and they did want to contribute because I think there is a strong sense of social responsibility in people who work in the private sector, even if that's not widely known. This was viewed as a very promising vaccine candidate. It just needed help, advancing it through clinical development. At the time, actually, this was actually seen as it wasn't going to be a commercial opportunity, and the Merck senior management thought that was a positive thing because they didn't want to be seen as getting involved in this public health crisis because they wanted to make a buck. I mean, it's interesting that they had that perspective because that doesn't seem to be like a viable concept in many settings. But the expectation was also that there would be a collaborative endeavor with the public sector to move this forward, and a number of those things proved to be true, and that was really amazing. But a number of things that were important didn't come to fruition, and as a result, I think it disincentivized companies like Merck from getting involved in these kinds of things in the future. What ended up happening is Merck agreed to take on this vaccine program. In order to do it, it worked with a wide range of public sector and private sector partners, including ones who, maybe have been, previously antagonistic of industry, like MSF proved to be one of our best partners in this. So when you actually have a common alignment and you get to know each other, amazingly positive things can happen. So, lo and behold, Merck got involved in this program in November of 2014, and very quickly, it advanced through a series of phase 1 trials that were done faster than they had ever been done before. It entered an efficacy trial literally within a couple of months of actually first getting involved in this program, and there was an efficacy signal generated by a WHO-sponsored ring vaccination trial in Guinea. So at that time, that was the world speed record from going from vaccine candidate to an efficacy result and a public health implementation program, which helped bring the outbreak to an end, which is a really positive outcome. It's important to note, though, that this vaccine, the same identical vaccine, was originally derived and shown to be highly efficacious in non-human primate models about a decade earlier. So in 2004, we already knew that this was a promising vaccine based on preclinical data. It had languished because people thought that we didn't need an Ebola vaccine because you could control it by public health measures, or if you even had one, you wouldn't be able to demonstrate the efficacy of the vaccine. So those are not conditions that people want to get involved in that. But it happened, and it was successful, which was great. It involved a lot of different organizations. One thing that's interesting is that, I don't want to use this terminology, but it's helpful. There are kind of winners and losers here, because when you actually have a number of companies that are advancing vaccine development against an outbreak-associated pathogen, the first one across the finish line has an enormous advantage, and it becomes exponentially harder for everyone else. And when this happened, I was actually worried that a number of companies would not get involved in future pandemic or epidemic responses because the chances of them losing in a race are probably greater than the chances of them winning. That fortunately didn't turn out to be the case for COVID, but that was, I think, a different scenario. After the Ebola outbreak, because I painted it in a favorable light, but it's actually the success of that program is what motivated me to leave Merck, because I realized that this is a really serious issue that we need to confront, and I wasn't going to deal with it working in a single company in a single sector. I wanted to sort of work to bring different stakeholders together, and there are a lot of, just like you're having this meeting today about lessons learned from COVID-19, there were similarly lots of activities, you can see them listed here, just a subset of them, of lessons learned from the Ebola outbreak. And I just want to remind you, and I'll reinforce this, a number of the lessons that were learned were not heeded. And we're going to potentially relearn them now, and that really sucks, and I regret that. So one of the positive things that happened, though, following that, this is what provided the impetus for the creation of the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, which you obviously know a lot about. So this was created in the 2016-2017 timeframe, and I think that was really positive. But one thing that's important to note is that there was no way, realistically, that CEPI, even with the best intentions and doing the best job, could be responsible for taking care of this by themselves. And in some way, I think people have expected them to do that, and that's just not a viable solution. You heard, by Dr. Yoon yesterday about the 100 Days Initiative, and the U.S. government has a similar effect. And this is, the different components that he described. I'm not going to go into them, but they involve both scientific and technological issues as well as, innovation issues. And all of these, I think, are very valid. But the point I want to make to you is that in isolation, this will not accomplish the goal, because even if you can develop the vaccine candidates, you're not going to get the outcomes you want. You're not going to get the impact unless you're able to answer, at least these questions. And this is just a subset. Who's going to lead this effort? You need someone who's going to, really make sure that it happens and the train runs on time. Who's going to make decision? Who's going to fund it? Who's going to execute the programs? Who's going to assume the risk, both the development risk as well as the liability risk, which is still an unresolved issue? Who's going to manufacture it? Who's going to manufacture it for whom? Who's the product sponsor for regulatory approval? We're not just doing vaccine research in isolation. We're doing it to get products licensed by regulatory authorities around the world, pre-qualified by the WHO and procured by UN agencies for use in low and many middle-income countries. Who's going to decide the distribution priorities, and who's accountable for achieving equitable and sustainable access? These are questions that need to be answered if CEPI's aspirations and the U.S. government aspirations are to be fully realized. I think many of you probably know John Cohen, who says a lot of interesting things from time to time, different categories of interesting things. One of the interesting things that he said, and I strongly agree with it, but he made an interesting analogy, which is the issue of complacency. When the threat is everybody's like on deck, but when the threat wanes, everybody disappears. That's happened with Ebola, that's happened with Zika, that's happened with it'll happen with COVID. It already is happening with COVID, as we know. John's analogy was with surfing. He's a surfer. Is that the time to actually work and get out ahead of things is when there's a lull in the action. It's not when the waves are crashing against you. And I think that vividly makes that point. But what are the examples of where this has happened before? And it's kind of this back and forth. It's kind of crazy. So when the Ebola outbreak in 2014 to 2016 waned, there had been a lot of investment made in that response. But when it waned, the government, the U.S. government and others, the U.S. government is the only one, repurposed the funds that they had allocated to that response. In this case, Zika had arisen. So obviously Zika was a terrible, problem. But they repurposed the funding to Zika research, and that basically left a lot of the people who are trying to address the unfinished agenda on Ebola kind of high and dry in terms of thinking about how to address things. And that was, pretty problematic, and you'll see that it gets even more complicated than that. Because the fact that they deprioritized this effort that both CEPI and the WHO and others had prioritized, the so-called finishing the job on Ebola, that meant making a vaccine against Ebola Sudan. It meant making a vaccine against Marburg. It meant potentially making thermostable vaccines. It meant, potentially making combination vaccines. And none of that happened because the funding dried up. So lo and behold, what happens? There was a Marburg outbreak in Ghana earlier this year. No vaccine available, fortunately, was contained. There's an ongoing Ebola Sudan outbreak in Uganda, for which there's no demonstrated vaccine with efficacy available, and there's a big rush to do this. And if they had simply done what they had said they were going to do, 5 or 6 years ago, we would have had a vaccine available to deploy immediately when the outbreak of Ebola Sudan arose in, Uganda, and we didn't. And so now the outbreak is waning, and hopefully it'll be controlled. We may not get to test the vaccine for efficacy in that context, but we need to be prepared, and we can't not go back to the way it was. Similarly, the cost of complacency impacts innovation. I mean, you've heard, the desire to have vaccines that have, longer-term immunity, better coverage against variants of concern, potentially able to block infection and transmission. The example here of a nasal vaccine for which there's been, interest in but no funding for. So the COVID isn't over, and we're already seeing this effect. Similarly, the costs of complacency are manifest in the access agenda too. This is up-to-date data from the world. In data, you can see the inequities that have been talked about a lot at the meeting about where doses of vaccine have been delivered, and you look at the daily COVID vaccination doses administered, and it's gone down, and we're not going to solve this problem in this context. And with even more concern of just news in the Washington Post yesterday about COVAX, the vaccine initiative to enable greater access, may be discontinued, and that would be very problematic if that's the case. Said Omar tells me that this is a misinterpretation, and that Gavi still wants to continue to do it, but they still won't address the declining vaccination rates, that we're still going to have this residue of inequity that continues into the future. So we can't stay complacent. How do we optimize partnership models to accelerate product development and achieve equitable access moving forward? When we're facing this threat, we can't really do what we've been doing. Like, we've been relying on private sector companies to either engage or not engage. We don't have a way of identifying the most promising technologies and prioritizing those. It's kind of an ad hoc thing, and that's not a viable solution in the future. But what is the right solution? Is it a public sector solution, public sector only, or do we have a more strategic public-private partnership model, which is one that I favor? And actually, if you want to elaborate on that further, I would hope that there are opportunities to not only engage the public sector with the private sector, but also have the private sector work collaboratively with each other, because these are global threats that impact everybody, and why can't we work together to pool resources to get the job done? If you wanted visionary or delusional, that's my statement there. So that is what is necessary. If we think about, how do we deal with the access issues, I mean, is the sort of global compact that could overcome nationalistic tendencies, is that actually feasible, or is that delusional? The WHO is talking about a pandemic treaty. We'll see if that comes to fruition. There's a lot of interest, as you heard, in local manufacturing, but is that really the right solution? Is that a viable, sustainable solution? There's not been a serious discussion about that, and I worry in some ways that that is being raised as a way of not dealing with the harder issues, and that would be a problem. And if the complacency comes in, then that isn't going to happen at all. Or alternatively, can we actually design a fit-for-purpose solution that would ensure equitable, affordable, global access? And I believe that we should be able to do that. We just need to get on with the work of doing that. And I really believe that, when we talk about scientific innovation, one element of it is what we call the science of partnerships, is understanding what makes a partnership successful, what makes it fail, and how do you come up with the most effective one. So we really want to have one where people are proactively engaged, working collaboratively together, sharing risks and responsibilities, and really sort of having clarity around roles and responsibilities so that the program can be executed as effectively as possible. There are a lot of stakeholders in this, and really the challenge for us is to figure out how to bring them all together in a way where we're all aligned. I think all of these organizations, entities, sectors have the same goals. They don't necessarily see eye to eye, and we need to figure out how to solve that problem. So we do have a world where there is alignment across the different stakeholders. And just to close, these are themes that came out of the discussions, at least as I've heard them. We do, over the past day and a half, we do need to optimize partnerships and collaboration. We need continued innovation for preparedness and response. We need optimal and effective approaches to ensure prompt and equitable access. And we need to do the work during peacetime, across the range of activities that are necessary. And we need a global framework that's going to overcome nationalistic tendencies. And the time to act is now and every day thereafter. So just in closing, I wanted to remind us all that this affects real people who are living in circumstances where these diseases are often disproportionately impacting. And this is a young girl who lived in Liberia in a community that had been heavily impacted by Ebola in the 2014 to 2016 outbreak. And when she heard the news about the results from the ring vaccination trial in Guinea, she wanted to share this message with everyone involved. So I think that's true for Ebola, that's true for every other disease that we're facing. And we really need to do better in the future. And I think your discussions over the past day and a half have been really positive in that regard. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark, for that excellent presentation. Guess I'll look toward the back. Time for questions yes, so we do. So if we have questions either from the in-person group here or from online, we welcome to hear them. Mark has apparently answered all questions. It was more visionary than I had hoped.
So if I may, I have one. So Tim Burgess from Uniformed Services University. So thanks very much for a phenomenal, visionary, not delusional, visionary presentation. A very specific question. You touched on this. Nice leader. I wonder if you might take a minute and say a little bit more about what you think might be required to enable the private-private partnerships that you're talking about. Public, private, certainly there's the public sector that, legislation and et cetera, but what about for private?
Yeah, well, I think, I think that's a really important question. In my experience, having worked in academia, government, industry, and now for a not-for-profit organization, I can't keep a job, so I'm sorry about that. But at least I've gotten to see things from multiple perspectives. I think the question really should be asked of industry, to have a discussion amongst themselves. Obviously, there are antitrust issues, but there are ways of navigating that. And I think for a number of these endeavors, I do believe that there's an appetite for that kind of collaboration, but it needs to be seen as a positive activity that the public sector embraces and supports. As you know, there are a number of analogies, whether it's the computer chip industry. There's a lot of pre-competitive or non-competitive collaboration. I think this public health preparedness is a viable model for that kind of collaboration between private sector entities, but it needs to be in a context that supports that and welcomes that. Because when I was at Merck, we were involved in an endeavor that brought companies together to try to ensure that optimal antiretroviral therapy was available in the most affordable way in low-income countries, rather than outdated drugs, and more toxic drugs that were commonly used. And that fell apart because public sector so-called access advocates criticized it because they felt that if industry is coming together, it must be something bad. So that's the wrong way to incentivize that. I do believe that it would be great if there was a serious discussion about is that feasible and how to make it happen.
Hi, Jill Gay with Works Association. There's been so much discussion of how to make vaccines available in lower middle income countries. And we know the best vaccines are made here. By the company, by pharma, that needs to protect intellectual property. So how, I still can't square the circle between that and getting the vaccines available in lower middle income countries. And how do you see that happening?
No, it's an important question, and that issue of intellectual property is often put out there as the barrier to access. I don't think it's a barrier to access. Intellectual property depends upon what the owners of that intellectual property decide to do with it. It is not inherently a barrier to access. If the companies wanted their products to be widely available, they would be widely available. And if you ask the companies what are they afraid of, they're afraid of very specific things that you should be able to manage. They're afraid of, issues around, quality concerns that would impact their markets in higher income countries. They're worried about product diversion. They're worried about, counterfeiting. They're worried about things that are things that you should be able to come up with a solution for. It's kind of odd because, Moderna and Pfizer, BioNTech, they don't file patents in the countries in Africa where there's been the least access of the vaccine. So there's no intellectual property to protect there. They're just worried about losing control of unique assets. And if there's a way for them to feel secure in approaching that, then there could be a totally different solution. This whole idea about having to make a Moderna vaccine look-alike would be an irrelevant issue when you actually had access to the right technology from the innovator, and you had a solution that can make it available in the lowest income countries. I believe that I actually strongly believe that there are solutions to this issue, but the debate goes back to this 1960s era kind of conflict between different sectors where there's just distrust that gets in the way of even beginning that dialogue. And to me, that is, I may get myself in trouble here, but I work for a not-for-profit organization now. That distrust and antagonism is more of a barrier to access than intellectual property ever would be.
And Julie, I believe there are a couple of questions from online. So Mark, a couple of questions from our listeners. So the Gavi board met yesterday to decide whether or not to end COVAX vaccine contributions to low and middle income countries. What do you think the long-term impact of COVAX will be?
Well, I think COVAX, studying that question about what happened with COVAX, I think is an important component of what you're trying to accomplish with this workshop. I think it was set up with the best of intentions, but it may have been designed in a way that doomed it to sort of not accomplish its goals. It goes to the question about if we all agree that equitable, affordable access is a goal, how do you design the best solution for it? Is it, procurement, which has been very successful by, UNICEF with Gavi support? That's worked great for many different vaccines. What's the best solution for a vaccine against a disease like COVID-19? Is local manufacturing a way to enable access, or is having large volume production of lower cost of good vaccines a better solution as long as there's a commitment to access? I worry about this. COVAX wasn't achieving the goals that it had set out for itself, and it was a very significant undertaking of the people who were working on it. So it may not have been a wrong decision to consider changing direction with that, but it's not a good place to not have a viable solution. And again, COVAX was born in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic as an emergency response. we need to design right now a better solution in advance for future diseases that we don't yet know the names of, so that we're prepared to enable access as quickly as possible.
Great, thank you. And I think we'll do one more question. Vaccine distribution has been a critical challenge during the pandemic. What are some of the key actions that can be taken to facilitate that distribution? The comments you have on that?
Yeah, I mean, I could speak for probably days. I mean, I think one is obviously infrastructure, which is important. There's, technical training and capacity that is necessary and needs to be supported and doesn't exist in many places. As you know, most vaccines that have been administered in many countries around the world were just for pediatric diseases. They were not for the general population. We need a way of addressing that. I also think there is technological innovations that could be done to make it simpler. At least to this day, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are stored at very low temperatures, which is not viable in many low-income countries. Technology could come up with thermostable vaccines. Technology could come up with easier delivery routes, so there are a range of activities that could be pursued to address that issue, but that too is one that before the next pandemic, we need to have a plan for how we're going to do that.
Carla, are you sauntering toward the microphone, I think? Yes, Sarah, great.
Thank you. That was brilliant. And I really liked what you said about the need to develop a science of partnerships. And I like that we're talking about not just research collaborations, but research partnerships. And the question, where do we start with that? I think that we've been talking about the challenges here mostly domestically. Things get incredibly more complicated when we look at the global landscape. You were saying earlier, the private collaboration is the hardest because the public sector has a role. Well, that's not true really in many countries of the world. It has a role here domestically because of the funding coming from the government. And Zeke was talking earlier about the convalescent plasma challenge. Well, we saw that if you look at Latin America and the Caribbean, we saw that multiplied by 10. And I just find myself kind of repeating the same things without really knowing what needs to be done. Yes, we need to develop this new science of partnership. Is there anything actionable that we can come up with now in terms of advancing towards better research partnerships in the future, or is this just, or is it all what we need to do now is just think what that science looks like?
Well, I'm actually pretty optimistic about being able to make progress on that, and I think discussions like those that have taken place at this meeting help. I mean, you need to understand what worked and what didn't work about the previous response and study that and try to see what ways would work better. I mean, the organization I run is a not-for-profit organization that has a pretty diverse portfolio of products, and there's no way we would be able to do that in the space we're working in unless we worked in partnership with different stakeholders, including governments, public sector entities, and for-profit companies. And we're able to do a lot of really interesting stuff, but we're a relatively small, modest-sized organization. You need to figure out how to take that to scale. And for me, the way you do that is really understanding the perspectives of different organizations and understanding what motivates them, what incentivizes them, what disincentivizes them, where are the ways they can contribute, where are the ways they would not contribute, and how do we create a comprehensive, complete solution for these issues in R&D and as well as access. And I believe that that's possible, but for people to get out of their silos and think about what would be necessary to accomplish success in the future. Because if we have this meeting another 2 years from now about a different disease that we don't have a name for today, and we're talking about the same issues, then that is a failure on our part. We need to maintain the momentum to solve these problems. And it's not an easy science, but it is something that I think we'll learn a lot from.
I think we have one more question, Mark, from online. Who in lower middle income countries best represents the public health and manufacturing needs of those countries. Activist groups are often unorganized and can be sporadically effective, according to the question. So who do you see in a permanent position of representing the needs of LMICs in conversations about manufacturing capacity and pandemic preparedness?
Well, I mean, that's a broad and important question. I mean, I think it differs in different geographies, and some of them I'm more familiar with than others. I mean, there's a growing interest in building capacity of organizations in Africa. So the creation of the Africa Centers for Disease Control, I think, was an important innovation, and they're doing a lot of work. You know, they're creating a new African medicines agency. They're building the infrastructure to be able to do the things that are necessary to do to accomplish that goal, and they need to be supported in those efforts, which I think they are getting support, but it needs to be augmented, and they need to be kind of at the table to be able to share their perspectives on how to do that, and they often are not.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Please, another round of applause for really an excellent presentation. Thanks so much, Mark.